You're listening to the Flex Success Podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzie, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in-the-trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media.
All right, welcome back to yet again another Flex Success Podcast. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by, I was going to say be Georged by, but I mean it makes sense, by George. Coach George, mate, how are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. How are things in Argentina?
Mate, very, very well. It's warm. It's very sunny. The sun is up by about 5:30 and it doesn't go down until 8:30, which is, man, honestly, it's delightful. You finish your day in the afternoon and then you feel like it's still the afternoon when it's nighttime, but it does sometimes get away from me, man. I'm like, it's 8:30 and I'm like, fuck, I should probably eat some dinner, like. So,
Yeah.
Mate, I would say how's grey England, but behind you, you've got a nice little sunlight there. It looks pretty good.
Don't let it trick you. It's freezing outside still. I went out just to quickly get some steps beforehand and it's not good. And this is probably the brightest it's going to be. And we've probably got about a couple of hours and be gone again. So wake up in the dark, go sleep in the dark. I'm sat here trying to act really positive for you, mate. I hope you're having a great time in Argentina. Looking forward.
What about you, mate? Personal updates? Anything exciting going on in your life?
I've been self-coaching, so I've been running my own stuff since not long before Christmas. It was, respectfully, I think it's going pretty damn well. Current conditions holding. I'm just floating around 100 kilo at the moment. Just having a little bit of a weigh up on busyness coming up to season A, weighing up, training routine, see what I can get away with, what I come up with the work routine and stuff, but still managing to keep things extremely tight with very little effort, I must say. And that's not to brag. I probably track maybe 1 to 2 meals maybe per day, but I've been doing this for so long now that the staples are just the staples. I know what to slap on the meal and get together. And the weight still gets tracked. It still stays consistent. And if it does go any other way, I'll just taper it back in a bit. I'm having a bit of a ball ache with my knee at the moment. A Cybex hack squat after coming back from Valencia. Should have known better. Come back in and felt strong. Pushed it up to 6.5. I think it was 250 kg on the Cybex. Got to like the 4th rep and twing. So I don't know if I've reopened the old tear or whether it's above the scar tissue. I'm waiting to go get it scanned, but nothing I haven't fixed before. Last time me and Joe managed to blow my legs up whilst I had the problem. So I know it can be done.
And you got to get on the cycling erg occlusion bandwagon.
Yeah. I've been on that. It seems to be, well, that and a pendulum with an aggressive amount of knee flexions seems to be okay for some reason. So no weight, obviously, but I can still get into knee flexion and fuck around with pauses and tempo and stuff to get some pump. So it's not all bad. That's what BPC and growth hormone was made for anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, man, knees. They may just be the fucking pit of my existence when it comes to athletes in pain for preppers, man. Like when the knees are shit, it's just a fucking punish.
I don't know because it's my own doing. I should have known better. I coach and I talk to people about these things all the time and do as I say, not as I do.
Dude, I hurt my back when I was 22, maybe, and I'm now 37 as of 2 weeks ago. And I don't think I've trained pain-free in that same spot since then because I constantly know how to train around it and never once have even attempted to try and fix the issue. I just band-aid that motherfucker for the last 15 years. So what do you do?
Anyone listening, that is not the way to do it. Rehab and prehab, please.
Like you said, do as I say, not as I do. I'm at least willing to acknowledge my shitness. Which, I mean, actually may even come to the topic of conversation today because I'm sure we'll talk about it from our younger days and then even now, I suppose, too, from time to time. We all have a little bit of bro in us, and that is trying to determine, I suppose, like, is training to failure necessary? Probably not a fair question, but rather like what are the considerations around training to failure? Is it quote unquote the best? Is it necessary? Is it potentially detrimental? Or what is best practice in regards to training? So sound good?
Very nuanced conversation because you can make arguments for, against, arguments that go into it being maybe bad for you, good for you. And I think context is always the thing we need. But hopefully we can give as much general considerations for everyone to try to take that information themselves and decide on their own context at least.
Yeah, I was saying when we were discussing what we wanted to talk about on this podcast that it's one of those things that feels like it's a bit of a dead horse that's been beaten to death, right? But like there almost always is still questions about whether or not it's necessary. Like even in our own private athlete Discord channel, we had a discussion there about whether or not we think training to failure is necessary. And we had, individuals that thought, yeah, like they will say, I think it's probably a good idea to train as at least close to failure as possible most of the time. And then we've had other individuals who actually like very much prefer to train to failure, but are acknowledging like, I'm not sure if it's the right idea. I'm just emotionally attached to putting myself in the hole. So there's a lot of like cognitive bias, but also a lot of ambivalence with failure training, I find. Because a lot of people know that they probably should do better because they know better, but the emotional attachment is just so difficult to let go.
Yeah. I mean, why do we get into training in the first place? Most of us aren't bodybuilders first that start training. It's training that usually spirals into that. And there's usually a love for a certain way of training that attracts you to it in the first place, so that you find as you start off. Hard to let go of those old.
Yeah, unless I suppose you come from that very, very, very performance-driven mindset, whereby it's more about performance than it is about pain. Perhaps that may be like the fun of it. But then also sometimes you can find those individuals who have been very good performers by virtue of genetic predispositions, and they've never really had to even train that hard comparatively. Maybe they're also not the best people to listen to. But anyway, let's just quickly for this, we're going to go through this hopefully in like a little bit of a systematic approach so people can follow through in the way in which we think about, considerations for failure. So I'll just start us off with defining failure. And I think there's probably two major things that you can define failure through. One of them would be like technical failure, which is simply put just the breakdown of form. I would say specifically in the breakdown of form, we're not talking about the slowing down of concentric cadence or like repetition speed. So that's like typically when you're making the muscle get shorter, the press, the pull, the squat, the hip extension, whatever it may be. So we're not talking about a breakdown of form and that slows, because it absolutely should. But we're talking about an actual shift in technical proficiency. So when that technical performance starts to break down, that may be what we classify as technical failure. More likely to occur in things that are like open chain and or like on a barbell, in a dumbbell, less likely to occur as typically readily in machines, because machines will control bar paths and stuff like that. And then the other type of failure, which is what we mainly will probably refer to, because we're hoping that nobody technically breaks down and everyone's technically proficient and takes that as a priority, is volitional failure, which is quite literally just your inability physically or mentally, technically physically though, to do any further reps whatsoever, in that you are just physically incapable. So volitional failure is that your perceived failure or your perceived effort stops.
I've always used the RIR for my technical failure examples to people, saying like how you see stimulus shift from primary muscle groups to secondary or tertiary muscle groups, like your rear delts taking over, trap taking over instead of the lats, whatever the primary goal of that movement would have been. And then volitional failure was, realistically, there's not a single bit of energy ounce left in your system, not even the will to live is helping you move that weight. At that point, you've really cooked the CNS and the nervous system has said, no, enough's enough.
Yeah, you've given it a red hot crack. So if you're achieving either of those, we can say that you're achieving failure. We're also probably going to refer to, maybe, I know I certainly probably will throughout the conversation, two other like terminologies. One would be RIR, or reps in reserve, which is a term coined by Renaissance periodization, Mike Isrataels and his group. We can just think of that as like the amount of reps you are away from technical or volitional failure. So if we say someone has an RIR of 1, we're saying they had one more rep available to do. If it's a 3, it's 3.
Expanding that to the RPE conversation, how them to correlate for rate of perceived exertion for anyone who uses that as their marker. So obviously the exertion, typically looking on a scale of 1 to 10, reps in reserve is usually from effective reps, technically 5 to 0, but probably concentrate on 4 to 0 more specifically. So they're kind of measuring the same thing, the effort or intensity of the set, but they go in a different sliding scale. So from say 6 out of 10 RPE would be a 4 RIR, 7 RPE 3, a 1 RIR would be a 9 RPE, and a failure would be a 10. But technically, the powerlifters would say a 10 doesn't technically exist, so maybe they'd argue that. But it's the method technically of the same thing, and just a different sliding scale going from up and down or down to up.
Yeah, they usually have like an inverted relationship. Most of the time people would say you don't need to do both. I actually quite like both, because sometimes people's perceived 10 out of 10 is different to what an RIR might be. So, I often give people an RIR, ask them to give me an RPE back and see if those two marry up. So that is why that may be worth discussing. And then you also mentioned the other terminology that I wanted to talk about, which was effective reps. And that's essentially like all reps that are currently being recognized as effective in driving a hypertrophic response. And that would be somewhere in the range, excuse me, as you said, between 1 and 5 reps from failure, or technically 0, I should say 0 to 5 reps from failure, but we're generally going to say within 1 to 4. Yeah. All right. So the question is, why then might training to failure, or as close to failure as possible, actually be encouraged? And as we've kind of just alluded to then with the effective reps comment, it's the reason why we may do that is because there essentially just appears to be a very good relationship between your proximity to failure, how close you get to failure, and then that stimulatory effect that those particular reps have on at least like influencing a hypertrophic response. They may engage that process whereby then hypertrophy could occur if all other factors are in play to then facilitate the growth response, not just to drive the hypertrophic response, like there is available growth here, but now you've got this like available, it starts the cascade essentially. The other why is the point of that is those effective reps is that the closer to failure you seemingly get, the greater the magnitude of effect those repetitions then have on a hypertrophic response. The only problem with that comment, though, is that then most people think of that in a vacuum and they say, okay, therefore, if 4 reps from failure causes X of a response and 3 causes X plus add a number, not 1, and then 2 is X plus another number, technically that magnitude of effect is getting greater the closer you get to failure, but it doesn't actually say that there is no effect from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And I think a lot of people, at least in practice, are messing that component up.
Well, there was the good meta-analysis we had from Brad Schoenfeld and the co-authors on that study. I think it was like 15 different studies they looked at, and they concluded that there was no significant difference worth noting between training to complete failure, which is how they defined it, and obviously there's limitations to that within the studies that they were looking at and the crossovers there, and whether it was really an accurate comparison. And they concluded it wasn't really significant looking at failure training or non-failure training, but the limitations there were that they couldn't differentiate between if there was a significant difference between 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 rep in reserve extrapolated in data yet. But I'd say anecdotally, we've seen in results in clients and in ourselves that the closer you train to failure for longer, there is an elicited change in response based on that dose-dependent response. So anecdote and experience would show us that there is a case there. However much that is measurably, we can't really say for certain.
Yeah, I liken the effective reps model to like from 4 reps, you're opening the door for opportunity, and then maybe from 3 to 2 to 1, that door starts to open up a little bit further. But just by being at 0 RIR versus 4 RIR doesn't mean that you don't have the opportunity to still walk through that door and get that growth stimulus. And this is an important thing to remember, because later on, we're going to maybe talk about the pros and cons of it, or even maybe the periodization of failure and when you might actually decide to, achieve failure in your training, and then why that may be important. So, yeah. The other thing that's probably important to recognize is that like failure doesn't exist in a vacuum, whereby even when you talk about that study, that was that meta regression study, I think you're referring to there as well. Like, we don't have the capacity to just solely test failure in a vacuum as the sole contributor or stimulator of hypertrophy. We also have the relationship of like tension and load to consider. Typically, like, and this is where it's interesting, is that some people may think that getting stronger means getting bigger, and it may, but it doesn't necessarily always work out to be the case. E.g., someone who's hypertrophy focused in the bodybuilder versus powerlifter.
Strongman, I was going to say they're the strongest individuals on planet Earth, and they may be big, but they don't have out muscle size. It's very weirdly put together.
Yeah, 100%. But we can also say sometimes that doing more load and focusing on a load or a tension progression can actually outperform one that's focused primarily on volume, so long as the effort, and when I say effort in this particular context, I'm talking about proximity to failure. Is that I don't want to use intensity, because intensity is typically or it's technically associated with the percentage of load relative to 1 RM. So, more load with more effort, you can actually get away with less volume. But then, just like not being in the vacuum, volume is also potentially a good predictor of like a hypertrophic outcome, and in this instance, you can invert that relationship. Like, more volume with less effort can actually equate to the same amount of growth. And we've seen this. You mentioned Brad Schoenfeld. We've seen this before in like 40 set studies, whereby people are achieving pretty tremendous growth with just more work. Similarly, we've seen that even in repetition-based stuff. You can grow at 6 reps, 10 reps, 20 reps, 35 reps, technically any of them, so long as you can do it well. And then we also even have, and probably less of a factor, but I still think one worth considering is you have the considerations for the relationship of like metabolic stress and maybe its influence on growth. Less of a direct contributor probably to growth, but there's certainly an argument for some secondary mechanisms. I'll primarily talk from an anecdotal perspective here, because we were talking about your knee and talking about occluded bike work. Like, that is largely going and trying to tap the sort of it's trying to really like drive a lot of metabolic stress, a lot of mitochondrial biogenesis, and then hopefully that machinery that you're creating through metabolic stress as a secondary sort of impact then allows you the opportunity to grow more. And I've certainly seen it. Like, man, I've 100% achieved results with low load, high volume, high metabolic work in people before.
So this is how you worked out Alex Connor's specific example with his legs as well, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Alex Connors did a lot of bike work at one stage. Actually, like, one of his preps was almost exclusively, the majority of his work was done on the bike. And I mean, you've only, this is not an appeal to authority, and you can't necessarily do this all the time, but we can sometimes look at as examples as at least giving us, some indication of, success. That whole like success leaves clues to a degree, with context, sure. But like, track cyclists, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of repetition and volume, and then a lot of strength work very far away from failure, because they're solely, focused on performance, but obviously an incredible amount of hypertrophy. So, there's an argument. But the point being here is that you can't just necessarily take an individual and say they train to failure, therefore they will get X, and this person will train to free from failure, and this will get X. They're very hard to compare because none of these things exist in a vacuum.
Exactly.
Any thoughts on top of that?
I think you've just summarized the intro to proximity to failure pretty damn well, to be honest, mate. I think training to failure has just been summarized well. My problem was just biting my tongue before I started running into later on points as we started talking, so I just limit myself there before we go too ahead and then have to come back. Should we dive into pros?
Yeah, man, far away. Pros of training to failure.
As long as it's done within the context of safe and efficient training parameters, good execution, training smartly, not like an idiot with poor form, then there is the certainty that we're at least driving maximal efficiency of stimulus that's going to equate to the adaptation of more muscle growth. So you're not leaving any progress on the table, which is the big factor and draw point of the attraction for people to say we should always train to failure, is because you're never leaving anything on the table, which is good. That's a very good point to make. I think that comes down to one of the problems we see in a person's perception of where they're training to failure, more so than anything else. If the individuals thinks they're training to failure and it's actually a 3 or 4 reps in reserve, well, them training to failure all the time is not going to elicit that same good response. So just saying that as a fact, you have to be taking it into the context the individual knows where true technical and volitional failure is, what that looks like, and how to cope and manage their parameters around that certain stimulus. But I've said to you when we first had the conversation, one of the points that I wanted to lead into was, yes, in my earlier years, it might not have led to a great response in muscle growth from me. And I mentioned this in the Discord channel in the chat, that I spent my first younger years training all to failure, and it taught me a hell of a lot. Now, at the start, I obviously was not training to true failure, but over time of trying to chase that feeling, I learned where true failure was. And then when the time come for the next mentor, the next coach to step in and teach me the next way of approaching things, started to add volume and other vectors that will drive hypertrophy, I was then able to manipulate my reps in reserve or my proximity to failure efficiently in a way that could teach me how to grow and recover from the volume. My biggest problem with my legs was I could not recover from training to failure all the time, and it was most of the time quite poor form, but I couldn't recover from that sheer load. It just didn't work in the same way that everyone else did, blowing their legs up. But when I backed away a little bit, once I knew I'd got the groundwork in, I could manage way more volume and the appropriate volume for me to then add the stimulus necessary to grow the legs. So there's like a stage to this, I think, as you're coming up in your early years of training, where there is merit to learning, obviously, again, form, execution first, and then teaching where training to failure is, what that actually looks like before you try back away from the case. Otherwise, you're stabbing or shooting in the dark.
Yeah, well, it's like that. I never know this quote fully, but it's like you'll never know when you'll get burnt until you fly too close to the sun, or something like that. And this is kind of the case with failure training, in that every time you think that you've achieved what may have been the final rep, the only way to find out if there's another one is to try until you finally get burned. Now, we want to try and minimize the likelihood of being scalded. But if we can just, a little finger on the hot plate and just burn the tip of the finger, just the tip. Liz will probably just timestamp that now. If it's just the tip, it teaches you, oh, there was one more. And there'll be maybe some strategies we can talk about for people to get as close to failure as they possibly can later on. But I think that argument of it's like a certainty of driving a sufficient stimulus is a fair one. Probably more so though, because it will at least ensure that you're getting more than likely 3 to 4 reps from failure than it is to, for example, to give an unskilled, unpracticed, and unaware individual a 3 to 4 from reps in reserve target, and them actually missing it by 6, 7, 8, or 9. So there's certainly an argument for that, but don't misunderstand, listeners, that by saying that it gives a certainty for a stimulus, that means that it is certainly necessary to fail in order to drive said stimulus. Yeah. 100%. But yeah, I think it is a very good learning curve. I certainly I find enjoyment in training to failure. I think that's one thing to certainly note. I think where some people may say it is unnecessary, they might be like, say, looking at the research, and we have to take research with at least the recognition of what that research is in practice. And that is, generally speaking, it's not like highly athletic populations training to the maximum capacity on the back end of already having done that for multiple years. Usually they're relatively new, it's relatively novel. But in saying that though, they're usually under supervision. So they usually are being pushed well beyond their capacity that they probably would achieve on their own. So we can probably say, hey, it is likely the case that most of these individuals are getting very fucking close to failure, if not at failure. And even though they are beginners, the relative test of are they going to failure or are they not is still contextually relevant for a beginner, because it's 2 beginners being compared to each other. Not necessarily saying just because they're beginners, that just eradicates the likelihood of this being the case. So, yeah. Any other pros to training to failure? Really, the one we've got here is currently we've got good learning curve in your younger years. It certainly will drive that. And then two, that we at least are maximizing the likelihood of a sufficient stimulus.
Certain that we are making progression. I think the other pro is that it looks great for videography and your social media.
Yeah, it's true.
Grunts and shouts in there. It starts dominance in the gym as alpha male. No. I think they're the two real main pros. But I do think it's quite important to touch on the cons of where failure training can be an issue. And I think the first one, of course, is a clear one, which is comes back to kind of technical failure, injury risk. If we're trying to push, or an individual trying to learn where failure is, and they push too hard trying to reach that position of volitional failure, but then lose their form and execution, it leads to instability through joints. You start to see line paths, disalignment between knees, hips, joints, elbows, arms, wrists. They can lead to tension, can create issues with tendons, ligaments, joint damage, issues and imbalances here or there. So injury risk does exponentially increase the closer you train to failure, which means you must have a good foundation of form and execution first. This is where my big problem with PTs come in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just more.
Yeah, I don't think, because I mean, how else can people measure the success of their personal training session if it wasn't through vomiting and then videoing them? I don't think people, and I mean, probably they should, to be honest, because not everyone is supposed to read physiology or even understand physiology. But the point is that the more and more that you drive yourself into the hole of getting as close to failure, you only have a certain amount of resources available to you with regards to, I suppose, like partitioning out your ability to control your nervous system, in that your nervous system is just going to try and stop you from dying, for one. And if you're under a squat bar, the thing it's going to do is just start shifting its sort of stimulus in as many different directions as possible in order to keep you upright. But fatigue is going to actually fuck around with that. Obviously, then mental fatigue, physical fatigue, the perception of pain, all of these things are going to interfere with that signaling system to the point where you can eventually just have some inefficient movement. So, you know, it's no surprise that there's a higher risk for injury.
100%. I think that there needs to be the same fashion as you would learn to drive a car, though. Before we jump into the gym, we should obviously look at it in the same fashion. And I wished I had back when I was younger, because it would have taught me a lot and saved me a lot of time, a week spent out of the gym, not enjoying myself if I wasn't injured. So I do think people need to spend a little bit more time understanding what they are actually doing, what they're trying to achieve with said movement patterns, and having the right person there to teach them in the flesh what they should be doing before they're trying to get up to failure. I feel like there should be a step process to this, much like trying to learn to drive a car or anything else that would inherently drive risk.
Yeah. So even learning how to fail, you mean?
All vectors of it. In order to learn how to fail, you must know how to perform and execute correctly first. So learn that first as a step procedure to this. To anyone who's listening about trying to find failure, learn how to train first with a good form and correction there, and then move up to learning to train to failure. Don't try and train to failure first and think the form's going to come later, because you will just hurt yourself. Yeah.
And also, because of that nervous system disconnect or interference, I suppose you could say, is that you want a movement pattern to be autonomous to the point where if something else interferes with your movement, that movement is still autonomous. You know, it'd be like, for example, like taking a baby giraffe and scaring them and hoping that they could run straight. You know, like, no, their legs still don't know how to function properly, so don't scare them, because they're going to fall over, you know. Whereas if you take a giraffe that's at least run for a few months and you scare it, it can still probably run off relatively efficiently, even though it's got another nervous system response from the fear. So in this instance, it's the other nervous system response is there's pain, and you want that movement pattern to be like the giraffe that has run around for a couple of months. Which is, and the other thing too is, for those that are closer towards the beginner side of things than they are the advanced side of things, is that the stimulus required to grow in the early years of training is sweet fuck all. It's just more than what you did yesterday, which is one set versus zero. You certainly don't need to be close to failure. So you should be learning technical proficiency, as you said. Fatigue management.
The biggest problem I found, obviously, with this was fatigue management for me anyway. So like I said just a minute ago when I was talking about the Discord channel, my old experience with it, I could not train to failure all the time. I was cooked all the time, could not work out why I couldn't progress in strength or reps all the time, until I started to taper back. I didn't grow as efficiently on my lower body like I did in everything else. So the problem with training to failure is that, of course, there is a tax to pay. There is a cost to this style of training, and that is your central nervous system. And if we think about the central nervous system like a bank, every time we train, every time we are pushing close to failure, we are borrowing money from the bank. We're essentially taking a loan from that, and eventually we're going to have to pay it back. But there's only so much the bank can loan, and that's specific to each person genetically. There's always a tolerance for there. You know, the phrases that are taken from the RP strength group again, you know, maximal recoverable volume or maximal efficient volume and minimum efficient volume. Those vectors and variables there, that's different person to person. And if you train to failure all the time, you'll borrow more money from the bank, and eventually you have to pay it back. The loan always then gets really debted back back to the system. And you'll notice that within your fatigue management, you won't be able to progress. The symptoms of CNS fatigue will creep in, and the typical parameters of deload start to creep up: sleep, digestion, overstimulation, epinephrine production, cortisol production, mass fluid retention, all the typical variables you'd see and exhibit around that time. And then obviously that then means your ability to accrue progression long term is then halted or affected, and you may not be then spending enough time in that position with that stimulus or direct stimulus to drive the adaptation that would be necessary for you as that individual.
Yeah, and then to wrap those two in a bow, like we have an increased potential risk for injury, and we have a decreased capacity to manage fatigue repeatedly, which then goes into the consideration of that repeat failure training may actually start to decrease your opportunity for repeatable long-term progression. And that is where I think bodybuilders need to rethink about or restructure their mindsets about how they go about growing in that. Now, you and I are very much in the camp of periodizing out long periods of time for our athletes. You know, most of our guys that are prepping have got like 52 and 60 and 70 week sort of rough guides and plans, right? But having the ability to have that foresight says that, hey, we are better off doing 90% as good as we can 100% of the time for the next 60 weeks than we are to do 100% for maybe 70% of the time, and then, you know, a little bit off. Like that average is, hey, we want to try and drive progression, not just this week, but next week, and then next month, and then the next 4 months, and then the next 10 months, you know. And when it's appropriately, you know, periodized out and planned, you can pick and choose points in time to have value training come in and be like the, you know, the stimulator of growth at the end. But if you're always doing it, your capacity to have repeatable progression for me is the biggest probably argument against repeat value training, at least. That's probably my biggest one.
I think you can get away with it a little bit more so when you, I think it's kind of where quite a lot of the argument for female-male comparison of training also comes into play. Like the difference, it's not necessarily the gender bias there, or it's more so the differences in load we're tolerating with bigger individuals. Thus means proximity to drive to this point of failure on the nervous system from that perspective is then thus way faster, way harder. So the bodybuilders, like some of your guys, they're open bodybuilders that are huge. They're going to be moving a lot of, well, some of them are probably moving a lot of load. Maybe there's a couple of freaks that are just, you know, weak and massive, but most of them will be moving a lot more load, which means volume considerations, parameters there for fatigue on the nervous system have to be accounted for. And that then means that sometimes if you're training to failure too much, you then can't extrapolate that long term, and thus have to get weird periodization of growth block, fat loss block, growth block, fat loss block, and work within those parameters. So the bigger you get, the stronger you get typically runs in line. It's not directly proportionate, but typically the bigger you are, the more weight you're moving, and thus your ability to then go from minimum effective to maximum effective or maximum recoverable then shortens as you get bigger. So again, for periodization is something to also account for. If you are a smaller individual, maybe in a lighter class and you're not moving as much load, you might be able to get away with it for a lot longer.
Yeah, it's one thing that doesn't seem to scale linearly in a weird sense, you know, in that just put some arbitrary numbers on it. If you were 70 kilos and we said squatting 2 times your body weight was very strong, you know, and you squat 140 and that comes with X fatigue, it doesn't seem to be that if you're then 130 kilos and you squat the same relative amount, that it scales the same. Like from my experience anyway, it seems to me that the total load is potentially a problem at a point. And that just comes down to absolute strength and not necessarily the relative strength. I'm not sure if I was very clear on that, but that's what I'm essentially saying is that I don't think relative strength scales with the same amount of fatigue as does absolute load. Because some of these guys that are moving, you know, like the capacity to squat crazy numbers, even though it may be the same relative load to the smaller guy, it just doesn't seem to generate the same level of fatigue. So pros, cons, when training to failure may or may not be appropriate. Anything else?
No, I think we kind of crossed into phase-specific periodization. Now, I think if we looked at more the acute term of like how I was saying in the Discord chat, like how we would manipulate it in a mesocycle. Like there is another vector of progressive overload that we can use here to drive progression for hypertrophy. We obviously think about loading or progressive overloading stimulus, so load on the bar, adding another rep, adding more sets, time under tension. These are all variables of the same thing, eliciting stimulus. But like we figured out that, okay, so 4 reps in reserve away from true failure is enough to elicit a response, some type of response, not no response. Then with an individual trying to manage recovery capabilities, we could then use that as another vector that could be progressed alongside that, say from like a 4 or 3 reps in reserve in week 1, then periodize that up across the mesocycle, progresses to the point of failure in the final week of the block. And that might be another way that we can then manipulate more stimulus. And if we have more control over the variable, it means we could train potentially for longer or more acutely for the individual.
Yeah, that's a big one, man. Individuals that are typically driving towards failure, they almost always either subconsciously deload their training performance without knowing it because maybe they're not following a fully regulated training programs, so they end up just doing less one week and they don't really pay attention to it. Or for those that are, they have to deload and pull back more frequently. So you actually spend less weeks in the year growing, so to speak, to bunny rabbit as that, than they do if they would just pull back marginally and add another week. And I've seen tremendous benefits in this too, like getting my guys going from say 4 up to 1 down, to even moving it to like a 6 up and 1 down. For me, like over the course of like an entire year, that's an extra 2 to 3 weeks worth of like very good training.
Yeah. So it was the same calculation that we said on the face specific organization. It comes the same as like, do we do the 90 and 10% better in the short term as well as the long term as well, to get more time spent in that environment that's leading to gains and progression.
So I think for people to like try and think about this is you always want to have something available for you to drive some level of progression. So like I've spoken about what I'd refer to as like the anabolic staircase for some of my guys. And I usually lean on there being 3 primary factors to do that. Factor number 1 is going to be food. Being in a caloric surplus with sufficient protein, that's anabolic stimulus number 1. Anabolic stimulus number 2 is exactly that, anabolics. We always have the opportunity to progress those. So that may drive some further growth outcomes. And the third one is training. The cool thing about training is that you have multiple different sort of facets of training that you can use to drive hypertrophy. But all you need to know is that there needs to be some variation of progression over time. It can be, like you said, a progression of additional work, more reps and or more sets. It could be the progression of tension via load, assuming that the exercise execution stays the same, because that is a factor of consideration. If you change the technique of the exercise, you technically change potentially the tension. So even though you add more load, you may not actually add more tension, especially if you shift positions. And then you also have like effort, proximity to failure. So we've got like so many things within that one training block to consider a progression for. But what we need to consider is which ones will yield a good enough stimulus now, so that then later on, when they run out of opportunity or runway to push, can we then lean on the next one? And typically, how it works with most individuals when it comes to training is it kind of goes in this somewhat linear fashion. In weeks 1 to 3, you're going to be able to press load and or reps just by virtue of technical proficiency, skill acquisition, and nervous system efficiency. So you get better at doing the things you're doing repeatedly. And by virtue of doing that, you're going to get better. Then, if we keep that within the range of effective reps, like we said, we're driving a hypertrophic response. We're not going to maybe try and drive the maximal one. Say with 3 reps from failure, 2 reps from failure, we're also now stimulating a growth response, but managing fatigue very well. As that technical proficiency starts to get better, and therefore your ability to progress becomes slower, you now have a card up your sleeve to play of, well, I'm going to take it 1 more rep closer to failure. There's another anabolic stimulus that you've had from a progression. The next week, the same. Then you may hit this point, you're like, all right, I'm getting pretty close to failure. I know the closer I get to failure, generally speaking, that's going to generate more fatigue. What opportunities do I have in the absence of failure training that I could potentially drive further hypertrophy? Now you could maybe say again.
Just do another set.
Add more load, add more work. Cool. Yeah.
Irrespective, it's the same load. If you just do another set of that movement, it is still a progression at the final stage. Yeah.
Absolutely progression. So now you're adding more load. Now, how many times can we do that repeatedly before we run into some issues? Now, some issues might be like you mentioned one, secondary and tertiary muscles starting to now take the brunt of that work. Everyone's going to find this with different movement patterns and different muscle groups. For reference, for like people, I know that if I do like a unilateral pull down, I could do like 6 sets of that shit and my lats just get more lit up every time. But if I do more than 2 sets of like a chest supported row, I go from mid back and traps to just fucking rear delts just getting lit up and biceps getting sore. So I know that I can't add sets to that. So now you're going to start to like nuance this and start picking exercises or movement patterns where you can add more sets. You're going to notice things like, again, to lean on Renaissance periodization. Does the pump get better with every set? Maybe. So we're still getting some more work there. There's still some more metabolic accumulation. Keep adding more sets, add more sets. And then eventually that runs out. And I'm getting pretty fucking fatigued. So what do we do, George?
Deload. There we go again.
Yeah, or you still have that 1 more card, right? Now we run this to legit failure. That last week, I didn't mention that. You assumed it.
Oh, I thought we'd already got to failure by the.
That's
what. Hey, yeah, cool. Sorry, man. I thought we'd already cooked that point. I
just kicked my desk. Yeah, I just kicked my desk, and you thought I'd already cooked it. But the point is, you added some more sets, and then you can also then start to run those sets into failure. But if you'd run the failure back in week 3, I don't know if we would have made the same amount of weeks.
Yeah, not by week 3. This is why I like to operate on that 3 to 1 kind of spectrum. By the time you get to week 4, this is usually why I like the 6 to 1 rotation, because by failure at week 4, then I've usually got 2 weeks of volume progressions that can be pushed there. Most of my guys have some volume added in few key spots as well. But just under that conversation, like then 5 and 6 are where my volume progressions would then happen before really cooking the deload off and maximizing on that adaptation there at the end.
Yeah, I pretty much roll two various approaches. One is exactly like you said. So it's usually going to be like weeks 1 to 3, find maximum performance, maximum load for the repetition ranges. Tick that box, RIR of 2 to 3. Then there's usually going to be like, all right, RIR of 1 less, RIR of 1 less, add a set, RIR maintain, add a set if you can. And then somewhere in there, I'm going to be like, all right, now we just take it to an RIR 0. And then it's reassessing each week. Can you do one more week of failure? And if you do you need more sets? And then pending the quality of the athlete, there's an auto-regulation scheme in there usually for set additions.
As I said, this typically the last couple of weeks really only come to fruition if I'm getting some very good biofeedback and some very good feedback from the athlete in my notes, because they're not giving me that. Doesn't help all the time just looking at numbers. We do need to hear about, like you said, secondary and tertiary muscle groups there. Where's that actually going though? Because you could be moving more, but it could not be going where I want it. So I need that feedback back from them. If they give me poor feedback, then you're leaving progress on the table. So note, guys, make sure you listen to where your pumps are and tell us.
Yeah, and this is a reminder back to the beginning too. When we talk about technical failure, we're not talking about a shift in technical implementation in order to achieve progression. We want to try and maintain technical proficiency, allow effort to drive us as close to failure as possible, and then eventually volitional fatigue will take over to the point where you can't do more reps. We've sort of lightly touched on this too in the failure discussion, and that is, I think you need to be smart about exercise selection in where you drive these sets. Do you want to jump into that?
Well, yeah, there's a with every bit of stimulus you're carrying within a movement, there is a cost, same as we've spoken about with anything a little bit earlier on. And typically there is a kind of dose-dependent response. So some machines or some equipment, so like Dean mentioned there, like free weights, barbells compared to machines, you're typically going to be a bit more fixed in. So the stimulus to fatigue ratio should shift in a bit more of a positive manner where you can recruit a bit more stimulus for the cost of fatigue in certain movement patterns. So it might make more sense, the comparative nature of a barbell squat to your leg extension or leg press, and say if you're locked into a leg press quite well, that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is better there, and it may make more sense to train that to failure earlier on in the block, or pick that as your movement where you're going to take it to failure on, say, a progression if it was leg specific specialization, as opposed to the barbell squat, because it's more easier to, when you fatigue cruise in, shift to the tertiary and secondary and tertiary muscle groups. My biggest one for this one is like, okay, well, why would you train to failure on a deadlift? I know everybody would always love to pick this one up, and it's like, oh, some love deadlifting, some don't. Oh, this built my back, this did this. Okay, great. But if you actually look at the S/F ratio on the deadlift, it's not very good for hypertrophy in the net. And obviously that disparity of muscle groups that are now incorporated in this movement to spread that stimulus across, and the fatigue just keeps going up on the CNS with less stimulus really being recruited in any kind of target specific area. So that was just an obvious example of a movement where the S/F is very bad. But again, the relationship there on exercise selection should also be considered for specific muscle groups, biases in periodization to what you're trying to progress on. If you're doing a leg specialization, to use that example again, you're potentially going to spend a bit more time picking where you train to failure, or maybe those muscle groups, and then backing off on other ones. And exercise selection could be a little bit more free, or give some more variation with, a movement that hits the rear delts in a pulling fashion or a fly fashion. So they've got a bit more choice and some fun with it. And then very specific to, this is going to yield the best result on a stimulus to fatigue ratio for what equipment you have available. This is where we're going to spend our energy. This is where we're going to push the failure, as opposed to here and bias around that specifically.
Yeah. So you've got phase-specific considerations, you've got mesocycle position considerations, and then you also have the consideration of exercise selection. I think the exercise selection is one that will also then tie back into your ability to do more work over time. So it is certainly one that needs to be smartly thought about and then executed. Because you can train to failure on a squat, but like even then, I'd probably argue like what is probably going to give out first? It's going to be something that is trying to structurally keep you from falling over, like your erectors, shit like that. It's not going to be the thing you're trying to target, like your quads or your glutes or whatever it may be. So choosing, yes. Say again.
I've never been able to use free motion squats, barbell squats, safety bar squats, anything efficiently within my programming. Just never been able to do it. My erectors just fried every time. The minute I get to a load that seems to be for my quads, back goes, no, can't hold it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, fucking, dude, yeah. Like I said to you before, I hurt my back when I was 22. I used to love squatting back then. Now it's squat machine. But it's just, yeah. Immobility is not my friend with regards to getting to appropriate squat positions. Anything else to touch on there? I think with regards to when training to failure may be or may not be appropriate.
I think we covered the main part there. I don't think there's anything else.
Yeah, I think the take home here is that failure training may elicit you a greater opportunity to grow, but it isn't necessary to drive that outcome, especially in the early phases of each training block. So consider using it as a card to play. Just like these aren't 100% fair comparisons, but I'll draw two. Just because a calorie surplus drives growth doesn't mean a calorie surplus multiplied by 5 drives more growth. It may, but the ratio of how much more relative to the amount of fat you would gain in this instance or fatigue you would accumulate in the failure instance isn't probably worth the consideration. Similarly with drugs, like more drugs typically will grow more muscle, but the question has to be like, it also is going to come, not necessarily maybe this as fatigue, but maybe because it's sympathetically, fatiguing to a certain degree, but maybe it shortens your growth phase because of some level of like organ or lipid, problems. And yeah, if you don't look at blood work, you're good to go forever. And again, like, why would you not want to like accumulate or give yourself the opportunity to play one more card?
This is why the low drugs is the same context. Is get maximum effective results off of the minimum effective stimulus, and you always have more to play to a degree.
Yeah, I mean that in itself is a great comment, man. I don't know why people wouldn't want to get the most out of the least. Like, I think that there's this. I was going to say, I think there's this mentality that it's lazy, but I don't think it is. I just think it's smart.
I'm not saying other people are, but because of my internal laziness, I want to do as little as I can and get as much out of it every time.
Yeah, but I think that also comes from like your level of intellect too, though, because I've seen like you like to train. You said you used to train to failure in the back. Like, you do love to train. So doing more training isn't a ball ache to you. It's enjoyable. But you also know that if I'm going to do more training, it's going to cost me more fatigue and more time, that it's going to piss you off. So like your intellect is obviously going to interfere that. But I hear like, man, but I'm always like that. Like if I could, like if I said to somebody, you can either drive, 7 kilometers to the left to then go 10 kilometers forward in order to get to your destination, or you can just drive straight for fucking less kilometers. Like why? Like everyone chooses straight. So like, why do we not choose the same thing for performance? I don't know. I mean, you could argue that you could do less training and therefore you are taking the straight line for failure training. But again, the point would be is like, yes, you can, but how many times can you do that same fucking drive over and over and over again before you actually have to learn to take another fucking route, because eventually you're going to crash? Or you just start driving to that route faster, you take more risk, right?
Hey, if it works, it works. More does more. There's a post-dependent response to everything.
Yeah, that is the problem, is that there's this emotional, more does do more to a point. Now,
something comes out of this conversation that is interesting, and I think I've said this before on one of my be less shit tips that come up on one of the old podcasts that I've jumped on for, and it's something I've repeatedly banged on about on stories about camp mentality being stupid. And I think we kind of touched on all of the reasons why having the ability to choose when to train to failure and when not to is appropriate. But all because of those aforementioned reasons, if you have like an emotional bias or an attachment to always training to failure or never training to failure, which I have seen nowadays with some of the newbies coming up within bodybuilding, the newer, like really just solely evidence-based people, I never train to failure because it's pointless. You're literally limiting your toolbox. And as a bodybuilder, as a coach myself, like that to me is like the worst thing I could ever do with any one of my athletes. And that's if they have that mentality, I work aggressively to try and get them out of it, because it then limits my options to be able to manipulate them further to the goal. My prime example of this one is, right, what are you going to do on prep then? You're going to get to 2 weeks out, or you're going to get to peak week, or you're carrying on training to failure. What do you do on peak week? No, you back off. So you are using reps in reserve. You are backing off. You're just calling it something different or approaching it in a different manner, because you need to at that point in time. But you could probably benefit from tapering things off maybe a little bit sooner if you have the opportunity to, or you can afford to within your prep timeline. So if you don't have that card to play because you don't believe in it, what are you going to do? You're going to cook yourself coming into comp? Well, a lot of people do overtrain into the back end of their competition prep when fatigue is already high. They continue training too high, and they wonder why they're always fluidy. They wonder why when they peak, they get this aggressive fluid response as well. Right up to last week, you was cooking yourself physically and your CNS is fucked. So what's peak going to do?
Yeah. The camp mentality is an interesting one. I think, you know what, as you were saying that, I thought of this, and I thought this is a weird thing with bodybuilders too, is that most people's what if goes to the negative instead of to the potential positive. So, failure training, low volume, high intensity kind of guy. What if I try volume and it doesn't work? Okay, what if I try volume and it fucking works? Like, and similarly volume, like if you're used to doing volume and you don't really train that close to failure, or you think you do, but you want to maybe see what happens over in this other camp, what if I back off my volume and increase my effort? But most people fear the loss of tissue or the lack of progression. The point is, you don't know until you try. So I think it's important to have a little bit of a combination of both. But it isn't a camp mentality, as you mentioned. It's not, this is better than this. It's, this may yield better results than this, but it also may be better for this muscle group in this point in time at this particular situation, right? So you need to learn where these things suit you. And I would liken it to, like, you don't want to like live in opposing camps. You almost like want to live in this like a harmonious sort of hippie camp, man, where like there's love for all. It's just that you may have a preference or a predisposition to bond best with this type of hippie, but it doesn't mean that hippie over there is worse. They're just different.
Yep. Yeah. The yin and yang. Yin and yang. It's not that nothing's ever just truly black or white. I whenever people say to me to summarize how I operate as a coach, I'd like to say I'm grey. I am so grey. I just sit in the middle of everything, and I just like to think I can pick from this side or pick from that side when I want to, and when the right time would be.
Yeah, man, I even remember speaking to Joe, a mutual friend of ours, Joe Jeffrey, years ago. And it was like, he said, oh, yeah, I had a couple of my clients show up to a competition together. Well, they came to the doghouse, his house, right? And they started like comparing notes and they realized that there was some differences. And they were like, Joe, like, why is he doing this and I'm doing that? And he's like, because you are you and he is he. Like, would you rather that everybody got the same thing? Like there isn't this program that Joe does, you know, just like there's not this program that Flex does, you know. So that's exactly this. It's a weird concept that it's like they'd be mad if he gave them the cookie cutter, but they expect everybody to get exactly the same.
Because they think there is a right way to do things. But with bodybuilding, I mean, hey, look, you can take all the wrong drugs and still be Ronnie Coleman. He did it.
Mm. And dude, actually, you mentioned the fatigue considerations for the really strong guys. I have quite a few people that follow Mike Pearson. Mike Pearson's a big motherfucker. He's 143 kilos at the moment, right? In the past, he's been just as big of a motherfucker, maybe not quite as big, but he's always redlined his training. That's been one of his things. Very low sets, redline that shit, to the point where I saw him redline a hack squat 4 days out before his last comp. And I remember commenting on his Instagram and said, is this normal for you? And he just went, if it works in the off season, it works for prep. I was like, cool, bro. Like, it is what it is. And then he obviously, thankfully for him, had the retrospection and the reflecting capabilities to go, something went wrong in that prep. Maybe I need some external help. And over time, we've sort of like worked him into this, like finding his happy medium between training very hard, but not training so much to the red line that he had to, man, he was a point where he was like, dude, I'm fucked up 3 weeks and I need to take a break. And I was like, all right. So now he has this auto-regulatory set progression model that he has in play. And man, he's the biggest he's ever been. He's the leanest he's ever been. And he's doing things that you wouldn't normally do. Like I'm legitimately giving him exercises to drive fatigue in his quads before he squats or leg presses so that he doesn't have to put so much fucking load on the machine. Because it's costly to his fatigue. It's fucking costly to time. He wants to load a leg press up. So although, you know, in some instances more load may be better, it sometimes is also like deliberately better to pull that down in preference for more volume and vice versa, you know.
So yeah, I'd say probably most people look to my Way program. I might even look like a volume guy, but it's not. I just like to find these pieces of information out in the data and then apply that over time. Zach is one of my prime examples, maybe not as big as Mike Pearson at all, but he's a fucking strong cunt for his size. And over time, we figured out that a lower volume approach works for him, you know, a bit closer to failure, higher intensity, well, obviously intensity by definition, not by the definition there. Closer proximity to failure, I'll say. Lower volume approach, less frequency as well, and he seems to be growing faster than he ever has. He's as lean as he's ever been in the off season. There's other vectors and variables to that, of course, but again, it's a process over time. Allow for the coach to play, allow for them to push, allow for them to pull back, taper, trial things, but don't just try things for 5 minutes. Try things for long, elongated at a time. Get the results, see where we go, change, adjust, and keep progressing. It's a learning game.
Yeah, and this is the barbecue sauce to the meat tray. It is, you know, like finding that right combination of volume to failure to whatever it may be for you. As you as a genetically unique individual, and also as a unique individual, like I said to you before, and I only just briefly touched on this, and I'll just quickly reference myself. This is like certain body parts sometimes you'll just be better off at. I know that I can get a tremendous amount of growth out of doing a fairly low volume leg approach because I really do like to train that one pretty close, and I get very quick connection, quick pump. But I know for my back, it just needs a lot more work, and the only way I figured that out was by doing more work to a lower proximity to failure. So there's going to be even some not only just individual variability between like George and I and how much volume we need per muscle group and per week, but also on ourselves, there's going to be a difference between our biceps and our triceps and our pecs and our backs and so on. So, but the biggest thing, as you said it there, is, man, is do it for fucking long enough. Like you really need to give something a red hot crack for a couple of months and see how it goes, measure, assess, remeasure, reassess, go again. So find the right combination.
Doesn't mean you're going to get it right straight out of the gate, but you'll find this piece of information and it's a lesson learned that you can then apply. So yeah, I was very lucky with that because he did dig his heels in and just let me go, right, let me find my information first. I know it's not how you like to train. Let me play with a few things. Matt would be another example. He always wanted to go traditional off season, lower volume, but no, evident, you know, biggest you've ever been, leanest you've ever been, because you allowed me to play. And I figured out and gone, well, this tells us otherwise to personal preference. So let's have a little play and see if we can find the middle ground that's going to get you everything you want out of it. Good progression, enjoyment factor. But I guess I think there's another point in that I just might have alluded to, which of course is training to failure versus maybe backing away slightly from failure. If an individual does not enjoy the way they are training, are they going to adhere and or commit with full intent to the application of their training program? Arguably not. I think that changes when you get to a more experienced, higher up level of bodybuilder, because the enjoyment then comes from, I've always said this, like, I don't give a shit how I have to train to progress. My enjoyment is I want to progress. I've kind of had that mentality since day one, which is nice to have someone who could nurture that out of me. But I think as you go up the ranks of bodybuilders into the more intermediates, your IFBB pros or amateurs chasing pro cards, and the goal kind of dictates it. Progression is the enjoyment, and they enjoy seeing everything go up. So whatever way drives that goal, they're happy. But not everyone, quite a lot of people go to the gym for mental release, psychological release, enjoyment. And if you get them training in a way they just don't enjoy, irrelevant whether it's perfect for their progression, they're not applying themselves with intent, you're not going to yield the results. Sometimes 80% of the perfect program with 20% enjoyment factor that gives them that enough to want to go into the gym still is actually the perfect program for that person.
Yeah, it's just a matter of understanding like what you have to play. Like if you are a guy who just absolutely loves failure, but you recognize that it may be slightly inhibiting you long term, but you're okay with it, you just have to know that you can probably get away with less volume, and vice versa. If you're not prepared to go to failure, then you better be prepared to do some long sessions. Like, and then maybe we can take a concurrent approach for the right person at the right time, where there's an element of very low volume, high value training, and an element of volume training. There's so many ways to skin a cat. But yeah, personal enjoyment's massive, man. I don't disagree with that whatsoever, because I know that I just could not be fucking bothered with high volume leg training. It ain't my jam. Like I'm like I want to pick one or two sets for this squat pattern, and I just want to just get in and get that shit done.
That can change over time though as well. When I was doing my leg specialization, there was a point in time where I was doing, I think my top, and people used to think I was taking the piss, but I did 9 top sets a hack. It was 7 top sets with 2 back off sets. It was fucking brutal. It was my entire session pretty much, but it was needed. And now I can spend 2 working sets on it and elicit exactly the same kind of response now.
Yeah. But you're willing to try, mate. That is it.
100%.
Final thoughts, George. Do you have any?
My final thought here would be to really spend time understanding your own perception of failure. I think that's something that we may have just lost a little bit there at the end, in trying to get someone to train, say, to reps in reserve, where they think, or even failure on that matter, just your perception needs to be understood. And a way to understand the perceptual reality difference is to film your goddamn sets. That's something that I think is important. That was a very easy way for you to gauge and see really if you are training to failure. Yeah, that's just a final point to add on there. Just to wrap it up, I think there is no one way to skin a cat. Whichever approach works best for you will come down to a lot of individual context, and you must be willing to trial different methods for a long enough window of time to find the right method for you. And that can interchange based on where you are in your training cycle, where you are in your years of developing as an athlete, and all the good stuff in between from genetic context.
Yeah. My final thoughts is that it is likely more advantageous to at least try and get as close to the sun, e.g. failure, than it is to try and stay away from it. Interesting for those that are playing at home on video, George just got himself a weird thumbs up thought. It's almost like you just was like, that was a great thought, George. Fantastic. For people that are listening, yeah, a little thing just came up on our Zoom call and it gave George a thumbs up. So cool. Yeah, my thoughts, it's probably it's more likely to be advantageous to try and get as close to failure as possible because of what you just said then, than it is to not. And that is that the one thing that we didn't mention is that, reps in reserve can be a flawed system if you don't have the skill to get as close to failure as possible. Because if, like we said, if we say do a 4 and you're doing an 8 reps from failure, then you're not even getting close. So there is that consideration. But I just don't think that it is necessary most of the time. I think it is beneficial some of the time. That is probably my take home. And I also think your be less shit tip, which we didn't officially put a top on there, is to film your sets. I think is fantastic. You should be seeing a slowdown in repetition speed on the concentric if you're going to get close to failure.
Where would you normally, so for some practical parameters, where would you normally say 3 reps in reserve would lie? And this is very dependent on movement pattern as well, because I can do a perfect set on concentric tempo, 1 rep from reserve on a hack squat, and people would look and go, that rep was not your last rep. And okay, it fucking was, because I know the next one's gone.
Yeah, it's a subjective. Unfortunately, it's going to be subjective because everybody does have. I'm the same on chest. Like I can be pressing, and then all of a sudden I'm not pressing. But I would say that you should at least be able to see a subjectively considerable slowdown in concentric repetition speed before you're getting close to failure. Technically speaking, you should be able to watch it get progressively slower. And there should be at least 3 or 4 reps where it gets progressively slower each time. But that will also change depending on the load and the amount of reps you're doing too. Because, yeah, if it's single joint, there is a fact. But I would just say that if you are filming it, you should at least be seeing a considerable slowdown on concentric speed. That's probably the only way we can say take home there. I think what you can do, though, is use that plus filming, invert your score, give yourself a 9. So what you should be doing is do your set, thinking you get to an RIR 1 or whatever it may be. Give yourself an RPE score, watch it back, assess whether or not you think that was true or not. And it's not always fair because sometimes film looks faster than how it feels. So that is important to note too. And then the next time you should say, like, I like the concept, like, gun to my head, could I do 1 more? And then if it's safe for you to do so, just keep thinking that, gun to my head, can I do 1 more? maybe there's one more, Like, always think there's the potential for one more until you can't. And then just reference your performances there, and you'll be able to see how far off you are. What I will say though is that if you have any kind of time parameters set up in your training from set to set, e.g., you only have like 1 minute rest, 2 minute rest, 60 seconds rest, or whatever it may be. One very quick way to determine how close you get to failure and whether or not you're actually accurate at doing so is just to give yourself very minimal rest, but still enough to give you some energy back, but not enough that there's enough physiologically to perform in the same way that you did prior to. And I would say that number at a top end dose is about 60 seconds. If you give yourself a 60-second rest period, you're certainly going to have not reaccumulated the energy necessary to perform exactly as you did before. And you can somewhat look at it and go, I gave that, an RPE 9, 1 out of 10. I got 20 reps. I rested for 20 seconds, and then I got 19 reps. Nah, mate, like you won't get close enough. So that's probably another way to look at that.
I always like to call people out when they log their RPE in their training blocks, and I look at the numbers and I go, well, that increased from set to set, but your RPE stayed the same.
Yeah.
And there's a little fishy here. Just think logically for a second, and they go, "Oh yeah, that doesn't make sense." So which one was a lie? Was it the RPE or was it the rep range in perception? Like, where was the? Yeah, it's always a fun one. Shit, called you.
Yeah,
this is why I like.
I did 20 for 10 for an 8, and then I did 20 for 10 for an 8, and then I did 20 for 10 for an 8 on a 60-second rest period. I'm like, cool. So you did 20 for 10 for a 4, 20 for 10 for a 6, and then you did 20 for 10 for an 8.
Shout out to Crystal for realizing.
That's 2 feeder sets and one working set. So yeah.
No decreases. No.
Yeah. Fine. There's so many ways you can do it, and there are ways you can play around with it. But less shit tip is film your sets, gun to your head test, compare. Something worth sharing, George, as we always have.
Actually,
I know I spoke to you about this before. I'm going to cut you off because you've got something worth sharing that is irrelevant to the topic of conversation. I have one that is relevant, which I'll just quickly share. I will say this is probably more suited to coaches or people that are just very intellectually interested in training. And that is, there's a podcast called the Data Driven Podcast, or you've got Stronger by Science with Greg Knuckles on there. They both share the exact same podcast. It's exactly on this, and it was on the meta regression and information on does the evidence now support effective reps. It's 3 hours long. And Greg Knuckles goes full Greg Knuckles on it. So you shouldn't listen to it if you don't at least have some like decent basis of understanding of like the scientific literature. He's incredibly good at explaining a lot of like very difficult subjects. But if you want to go all in on this concept and the nuance and the little bits and pieces, it's a really good podcast to listen to. So Data Driven Podcast or Greg Knuckles, Stronger by Science, does the evidence now support effective reps. What's yours, George?
Mine, a little bit off topic, as you said, but I feel like all the other ones that were relevant to this conversation have kind of been rinsed and repeated. This wasn't one that I thought had been done on the Flex podcast, but I think you might have recommended it before, as you alluded to earlier, Dean. But this was a recommendation from Liz to read or listen to an audio book, and it was a book called The Invisible Woman. Obviously, it'll be tagged in the show notes, YouTube notes. Let me find out who the author was before I butcher it. By Criado-Perez. I'm not going to say her middle name because I will butcher it. Criado-Perez, The Invisible Woman. And for any... I can be an opinionated person when it comes to topics because I genuinely feel like I do look at things from both sides of the coin and come to a deliberated conclusion that's usually a resolve more than an opinion. This, I have nothing to say. It's a subject that I think it's opened my eyes up to way more vectors and factors and variables that I had never considered before, and it is an eye-opener to listen to. And if you're a person of data and statistics, you cannot really argue some of the data. You obviously have to take with a pinch of salt, as we always do in science, but when it's so foolproof in the large scale that it is, you can't really ignore it. So yeah, I have very little to say, and that's very rare for me. So if anyone is wondering on a good book to listen to, and especially as a male in this society, I challenge every male to listen to it, and female. There's a lot of good takeaways for females as well in there. But yeah, fucking awesome.
Yeah, so invisible women being, I think, women and the data gap between there being a data gap basically between women in the research as well, and then why some of the things that we take for granted, I think you can probably say, or just see as normal in today's society, how they are actually very male driven and completely forget females, and in some instances not even forget, actually just deliberately or just don't care.
Yeah.
Again, like I would say that I'm somebody who has always felt like I've at least had a fairly reasonable understanding of the difficulties that some women may face. But there are a ton of examples in this where you're just like, oh, of course. Like, why aren't women's toilets bigger than men's? Why do women not get considered when it comes to the vests and wear for police? And like, there's so many. You're like, what the fuck? Yeah.
Yep. The travel one was what got me the most. In the literally the first real proper chapter was just diving into it. The travel situation. How can travel be male biased? It can, and it's not maybe intentional. It's just that the male brain is the one usually creating this in the setup of the system. So whether on purpose or not, it biases in that direction. And there's a lot of work to be done. But like I said, usually I have opinions that are related to a resolve, and I nada to say just.
Yeah, there's so many cool ones. I think I'm even now getting some flashbacks, like town planning and sidewalks for prams. You know, there's a ton, man. It's honestly a great book. Say again.
Snow clearing past the roads. You think that's a travel consideration, but it's not. It's a male biased decision.
Yeah, it's a cracker. I think it's a really good listen to. And I think actually this is probably even a good reference, mate. Is don't be emotionally attached to the idea that you are somebody who thinks that there is no gender gap, and like your rudimentary understanding of the gender gap is that or equality is that we want everyone to be equal. It's just listen to it with an open eye, open brain, and might be surprised by some of the shit you listen to. You see here, sorry.
And there will be points that if you have got maybe beliefs in yourself without realizing from gifts of the parent, gifts of the father, typically I'd say, be ready to have them challenged. There will be a couple of times where you want to meet it with defense and you go, oh, hang on a minute, shut up. No, open your eyes, open your mind up, definitely when you're listening to this one. It's very, very good. Or reading.
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of times where you go, hang on a minute, and you go, oh no, fair enough, she covered that. Damn it. All right, never mind.
Yeah, the point I was going to make, you've already fucking challenged it and beaten it. Shit.
Yeah. Would you rather, mate? I passed you the flame on this one, so.
I will start with the sensible one. I've got two for you, man, because I feel like Liz always does such a bloody good job of these. It's a bit of pressure, really, to make it funny. But the serious one, would you rather be able to control animals, excluding humans, or would you rather be able to control anything electronic?
As in, I can make them do whatever I want?
Yep. You know, if you wanted a monkey to give you a blowjob.
I mean, I don't think I'd have to probably do too much convincing on that. What I would be able to do, at least in that instance, is tell it not to bite it off. That would be less of the don't do this as opposed to the do this. I don't really know if I'm trying to think about like what advantages I would get for being able to tell animals what to do. To be fair, I really love animals how they are. I don't think I would ever want to use them as a form of servant or slave, so I wouldn't use it, in a mean sense. I'm trying to think whether or not that I would increase the quality of their lives. I'm not sure, other than to tell them not to eat each other, but then that would arguably mess up the whole fucking prey and predator situation. So I'm probably not going to do that. I ain't God. So to be able to control anything electronically, or any electronic, did you say?
Anything electronic, anything that's.
What do you mean by that? By control it?
You can manipulate it, TVs, laptops. I'll say one in a minute that will lead on to my thoughts of it. Electronic cars, trains, anything. Could be negative, it could be positive, or it could also be AI.
Are we saying that AI is electronic?
It exists inside an electric. If you take away electricity, the AI disappears from our planet. Technically, it still exists, but it's space.
On the comment of AI, I'm going to say that one because I think AI has a tremendous amount of opportunity to provide us with a shit ton of positivity in our lives. But I would like to have the opportunity as electricity god, captain of all currents, to say, ask a few people that I think have got very well-versed opinions and understandings of AI and how it can better the world, and then tell it what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a smart choice. I've pondered that one for quite some time. I generally would use all of the animals to get rid of all of the humans, to be honest, get rid of the problem, and then let them live freely. Then I'd lose the control and just, you crack on.
But then AI might control the animals, and then what happens?
Yeah, okay.
Depends how far along AI has gotten before the animals had the opportunity to kill all the humans.
That's got to happen quick, though, eh?
It'd be far away. No, just kidding.
Otherwise, we will keep pondering that one for too long. The next one, which was quite funny. Would you rather suck a homeless man's dirty toe, bearing in mind this context to give it some numbers here, hasn't showered in probably the last 3 years, or Dr. Mike Isrataels' penis straight out of the shower, freshly clean?
Of course, it had to be Isratel. How is there a time on this? I'm assuming I need to get the job done on Mike.
Yeah, well, no, I'd have to. So to make it fair, you'd have to set a time frame to be appropriate for both. So I'd assume Mike may, if he sees you, Dean, he may blow quite quickly. So let's say it's probably going to take under 2 minutes, right? It's an exciting concept. So that's under 2 minutes. So you've only got to suck the homeless man's toe for the same time that it takes for him to ejaculate.
He would only be that excited because he'd feel dominant. Let's be honest. I don't know if I could look at Mike the same ever again, and I really like Mike. I feel like even though he is a superior intellect and maybe even a superior human, I don't know. We don't know each other that closely. I would hate to feel that inferior to him. Like I've been his bitch. It might just question. It might make me question. And also, the toe's pretty disgusting, but I could probably get it. I mean, I'm sure I've eaten toe before. I mean, I may have eaten penis. I just wouldn't know.
True.
Look, man, I've eaten brain. I've eaten pork throat. I've eaten a few weird things in my time nowadays. So,
thought process has nothing to do with the fact that it is you sucking dick. It's just whose dick it is that is the problem. The control aspect.
The dick is, if anything, Mike's dick maybe have swayed me because I think it'd be hilarious. You know, he's also a very hairy man. This is I'm going to go toe. I might argue, even though it's out of the shower, I'm going toe. I also have said to Liz that I wouldn't suck a penis for any kind of number of money. That's good English. Any kind of amount of money. It's just not within my. I think it's easy to say you would until you think about doing this, and then I'm like, I'm out, and then I'm out.
I mean, the hand size was my concern there. For anyone watching this, like, what the hell?
Well, I wouldn't hold it. I'd just be open handing it, like, ugh. I'd probably like, stick warm it.
Tiny burn.
Exactly. Yeah, man. I'm gonna go to toe. I'm sucking toe.
I think I would have as well. I'd definitely rather swash bleach around my mouth afterwards to kill any bacteria and spit and deal with the burn than whatever's going on with Mike Isrataels.
I mean, if anything, it's just going to make my gut microbiome healthier, right? Isn't it? Is it just going to challenge that system?
Probably would, but then again, you could say there's probably a lot of good, micronutrients in.
It's possible, but let's not say that. And on that wonderful note, on that sweet salty note, whichever way you look at it. Everybody, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please, as always, give it a like, give it a share, give it a 5-star review on any podcast platform. Tag us in if you've got any favorite clips. And as always, thanks for listening.